Okay, so I want you to just close your eyes for a second and picture this scene.
Right.
It's late April. We're in the Rose Garden.
Oh, right. That day.
Yeah, that day. The spring sun is hitting the White House. The shutters of 100 cameras are just clicking away. And there stands Donald Trump.
But he's not behind the podium.
No, he's not behind the podium. He's standing next to a prop.
The famous blackboard.
The blackboard, exactly. I mean, it looked like something out of like a university lecture hall or maybe a football coach's locker room.
Yeah, it was very visual.
And on it written in chalk was this list of countries and a list of percentages. He called it Liberation Day.
Right.
And watching it live, it really felt like the tectonic plates of the global economy were shifting. Like he wasn't just giving a speech.
He was rewriting the operating system of global trade right there on live television.
Yes, exactly.
It was political theater, certainly, but it was also this massive display of raw executive power. It felt permanent. It felt like the new status quo.
And that is the key word right there.
Yeah.
Permanent. Yeah. But here is the twist for you listening today. Fast forward to this morning. That blackboard,
Yeah.
you might as well just take a wet eraser to the whole thing.
Completely wipe it clean.
Because the breaking news is that the United States Supreme Court has stepped in and effectively said, not so fast.
And not so fast is putting it incredibly politely.
Right.
This is a judicial earthquake.
Right.
The Supreme Court has ruled against the administration's entire global tariff package. The weapon, and by the way, that is the exact word the administration used.
They literally called it a weapon.
Right, the weapon has been dismantled.
So that is our mission for today's deep dive. We're going to unpack the sudden death of this Liberation Day policy.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. So we're going to break this massive news story down through two specific lenses.
Okay.
First, we know a lot of you listening use this deep dive to actively sharpen your English.
Which is such a great way to learn.
It really is. So we're going to adopt an English learner perspective first. We'll decode the specific jargon and action verbs the media is using today.
Because the specific words used in the ruling and the reporting, they actually tell a story that goes much deeper than just the headlines.
Exactly. It's about decoding the attitude behind the news. And then second, we are doing the fact lens. We will break down exactly what the policy was, why the court killed it, and all the economic aftershocks.
And we'll summarize all of that clearly for you by the end.
Right into 3 clear points. But let's start with the language lens.
The vocabulary.
Yeah, I've been reading the news wires all morning, and there are 3 or 4 terms that just keep popping up everywhere.
Let's hear them.
So if you don't speak Washington or you don't speak legal English, you might miss the nuance here. The first one is the difference between repealing a law and striking down a law.
Oh, that is a vital distinction.
Because all the headlines today say Supreme Court strikes down tariffs. They don't say cancels. They don't say repeals.
Right, so a repeal is legislative.
Meaning from Congress.
Exactly. It's Congress saying, we passed this law, we changed our minds, now we're taking it back. It implies a choice. It implies a change of heart by the lawmakers.
Striking down.
Striking down is judicial. It is the court saying this action is invalid. It is void.
It sounds much more violent, like a lightning bolt.
It is violent in a legal sense. It's the judicial branch telling the executive branch you stepped out of line. It is not a policy disagreement. It's a constitutional rebuke.
Wow. Okay. Which brings us to the second phrase I'm seeing everywhere. If you look at the official White House press releases, they use the word impose.
Right, as in the president imposed tariffs.
Yes. But if you read the journalists' analysis pieces, they all say he slapped on tariffs.
Slap on is a fantastic phrase for English learners to note. It's very visual.
It sounds like a bumper sticker. Or sticky note.
Or a Band-Aid, yeah. See, when you impose a tax, it implies a careful process.
Like there were studies and committees.
Exactly. An economic impact report is slow rollout. It sounds orderly and very governmental.
But slapped on.
When journalists say he slapped on extra tariffs to European countries, they are signaling that this was hasty. It was forceful, perhaps even a bit careless.
Like he just woke up, decided to do it, and just slapped it on.
Precisely. And that links directly to the legal argument we'll get to later about the lack of process.
Okay, there's one more phrase we really have to flag because it perfectly explains the strategy with China. The phrase is ratchet up.
Ah, yes. Ratchet up. It's a mechanical metaphor.
Like the tool in Garage.
Right. A ratchet is a tool that allows movement in only one direction. You click it forward, it locks. Click it again, it locks tighter.
You can't just easily pull it back.
No, you'd have to release the whole mechanism. So in a trade war context, it describes the escalation ladder.
Meaning the U.S. raises tariffs, then China retaliates.
So the U.S. raises them again. The tension only goes up step by step, clicking tighter and tighter.
It really is the perfect verb for what we saw between April and today, just ratcheting up.
It is.
And the final word we need to decode, the one that essentially killed the entire policy today, is unilateral.
That is the absolute core of the Supreme Court case. Unilateral means acting alone.
One side.
Yes. In this context, it means the president acting without the consent or input of Congress.
Acting like a king, basically.
The Supreme Court didn't rule that tariffs are bad economics. They stay completely out of that. They ruled that the president does not have the unilateral power to inflict them.
Okay, so if we synthesize that whole language lens for our learners out there, the news isn't just that the tariffs stopped.
Right.
It's that the unilateral slapping on and ratcheting up of these taxes was struck down for being unconstitutional.
That is a perfect summary. You've got the whole headline right there in one sentence.
All right, so let's shift to the fact lens now. Let's really break down the reality of what just happened.
Let's do it.
We're going to organize this into 3 main points for you.
Point 1 being the core content of the policy itself.
Yes. Point 1 is the core content, because we need to remind everyone what was actually on that blackboard in the Rose Garden.
It wasn't just a blanket tax on everyone. It was highly specific.
They called it reciprocal tariffs.
Which is basically, you hit me, I hit you.
Exactly. Trump's philosophy, and honestly, he has been remarkably consistent on this since the 1980s, is all about leverage.
He believes the U.S. is constantly being taken advantage of in global trade.
Right. So his argument is if the European Union taxes American cars at 10%, then we should tax German cars at 10%.
So on Liberation Day, he laid out the new rates. The baseline for almost everyone was 10%.
But there were massive outliers.
Significant ones. The EU was hit with 20%.
Japan was at 24%.
India, 26%.
And then there's a Cambodia anomaly.
49%.
Yeah, 49%. Why Cambodia? Did I miss some massive U.S.-Cambodia beef? I mean,
Yeah.
a 49% tax seems incredibly punitive for a country with a relatively small economy.
It does seem totally random until you look under the hood. This is where you have to understand global supply chains. Cambodia does not produce enough independent goods to warrant a 49% tariff on its own. This was a transshipment penalty.
Transshipment. What does that mean in this context?
The administration believed, and they had pretty solid data to back this up, that Chinese companies were manufacturing goods in China.
Shipping them over the border to Cambodia.
Exactly. Slapping a Made in Cambodia sticker on them and then sending them to the U.S. to avoid the China-specific tariffs.
Oh, wow. So it's a bank shot. You hit Cambodia to hurt China.
Because China was the real target, the whale. The tariffs on China were ratcheting up to over 100%.
Over 100%. That's not a tax, it's a wall.
It was effectively a total embargo on Chinese consumer goods. The Cambodia tariff was just the administration trying to close the back door.
Now, really quick, I need to clear up a misconception I saw flying around online this morning.
Sure.
I saw people asking, is the price of steel going down now? Because Trump had tariffs on steel and aluminum too. Are those gone?
That is a critical distinction to make, and it's where the legal weeds get a little thick. The Supreme Court struck down the global tariffs today.
The Liberation Day ones.
Right. Those were enacted under a specific law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
IEPA. Got it.
But the steel and aluminum tariffs, those were done years ago under an entirely different law. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act.
Well, what's the difference?
Section 232 is focused specifically on national security. The court did not touch Section 232 today. So the tariffs on metals, they stay. The Liberation Day package, that's gone.
That is a huge difference. One relies on a vague economic emergency and the other on national security.
And the court treats those two concepts very differently. National security is usually a trump card where the courts back off.
No pun intended.
Right. But an economic emergency, that is much harder to prove in court.
Which leads us perfectly to point 2.
The legal basis.
Yes. Point 2 is the legal basis for why this was struck down. Why did he lose this case? Because we have to be real here. Trump built this current Supreme Court.
He appointed 3 of the justices himself.
There is a 6-3 conservative supermajority. Politically speaking, you would think he'd be bulletproof.
You would think so. But this court, for all its conservative leanings, is heavily, heavily focused on the text of the Constitution. They are textualists.
They care about the separation of powers.
Deeply. And Article 1 of the Constitution is crystal clear about money.
It says the power to lay and collect taxes, including tariffs, belongs exclusively to Congress, not the president.
Exactly. So the only way Trump could argue he had the power to do this was by using a loophole.
The Emergency Powers Act.
He declared a national emergency. He invoked IEPA. He basically said, we have a massive economic emergency, so I need emergency powers to fix trade right now.
And the court clearly didn't buy that.
No, they shredded that argument entirely. And this is where the economic analysts in our sources get really interesting. One analyst pointed out that IEPA was designed for things like freezing the bank accounts of actual terrorists.
Or sanctioning rogue states like North Korea.
Right. It was not meant for setting tax policy on French wine and German cars.
Right.
And the really damning part, the text of the Emergency Powers Act does not even use the word tariff.
It's just entirely missing from the law.
Absent. So the court essentially said you cannot use a vague emergency power to unilaterally rewrite the entire United States tax code.
One of the quotes from our sources called him just a bloke who doesn't like permission.
Which really cuts to the core of the executive mindset, doesn't it?
It really does. And the Chief Justice's logic in the majority opinion was pretty brutal. He basically said, if these tariffs were such a vital economic necessity, the president should have just asked Congress to pass a law.
And the Republicans currently control Congress.
That is the real sting. The court is pointing out that your own party runs the legislature.
If you couldn't convince your own team to pass this, you certainly can't do it by yourself by executive decree.
It kind of exposes that he knew he couldn't win the political argument in Congress, so he tried to use that unilateral shortcut.
And the shortcut turned out to be a dead end.
Okay, so the policy is dead. The legal reasoning is the separation of powers. Let's talk about the fallout, which brings us to point 3.
To ramifications.
Yes, point 3, ramifications. Because Trump was predicting an absolute apocalypse if he lost this case.
He posted a few weeks ago that if the court struck this down, the country would be screwed and it would cost the U.S. trillions.
Right, so I looked at the markets first thing this morning. S&P 500, up. NASDAQ, up. Why is Wall Street popping champagne if the president says we're doomed?
Because Wall Street knows how tariffs actually work in the real world. There is a massive misconception, one that the president repeats often, that foreign countries pay the tariffs.
Right, the idea that China is just writing a giant check to the U.S. Treasury.
Which is completely false. The U.S. importer pays. If an American tech company brings in parts from China, that American company pays the tariff at the border.
So it's essentially a tax on American businesses.
Yes, it increases their cost of goods sold, it squeezes their profit margins.
So when the Supreme Court suddenly makes those tariffs vanish,
it is an instant, massive tax cut for American corporations. Their costs drop, their profits theoretically go up, and so the stock price jumps. The market loves certainty, and it really loves lower taxes.
Well, wait a minute. The government was collecting a ton of money from those taxes.
A staggering amount. In 2025 alone, these Liberation Day tariffs raised nearly $280 billion.
$280 billion. That is not pocket change. That's larger than the GDP of New Zealand.
And this is exactly where the real chaos begins, because if the Supreme Court just said the collection of that money was illegal...
Oh, wow. Who owns that money now?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. Imagine you are the CEO of a major American retailer. You paid $500 million in tariffs last year. The Supreme Court just told you the government had no constitutional right to take that money from you.
I am calling my lawyers immediately. I'm going to sue to get it back.
Exactly. You want a refund, but the government has probably already spent it.
Of course they have. It went into the general fund. It paid for the military or Medicare or interest on the national debt.
So we are looking at a potential massive refund crisis because the Supreme Court ruling today was completely silent on how to handle refunds.
Just left that door wide open.
We could see years of litigation creating a huge fiscal hole for the Treasury. It's a legal concept called unjust enrichment.
What a mess. And what about the international side of things? Because Trump was using these tariffs as a giant club.
He absolutely was.
He was going around the world signing trade deals, basically saying, sign this new agreement or I hit you with a 20% tax.
Our sources indicate he signed over 20 international agreements since April using that exact leverage.
Classic strong-arm diplomacy.
It works really well right until the arm gets cut off. Now the Supreme Court has taken the club away. The consensus among global trade experts today is that those 20 trade deals are now on incredibly shaky ground.
Why would they fall apart?
Because of something called the credible commitment problem.
Okay.
Think about it. If you are Japan or the UK, why would you continue to honor a trade deal you were forced into now that the threat used against you has been ruled illegal?
Oh, I see. They might just walk away.
Or demand a total renegotiation. The diplomatic foundation of the last year is crumbling because the fear of those tariffs is just gone.
Wow. So this brings us to the final question of the deep dive.
Yeah.
What happens next? Is this it? Does the administration just shrug and say, well, we tried, and go back to normal?
No, absolutely not. If you have followed this administration at all, you know they do not accept defeat.
They reload.
Exactly.
So what is Plan B?
We are already hearing chatter from inside the Commerce Department. Specifically, officials are looking at the tool shed to see what other executive powers they have left.
And what did they find in the shed?
Well, remember how I said the steel tariffs survived because they used the national security argument?
Section 232, right?
Right. The administration might try to take that and relabel everything as a national security threat. Not an economic emergency, but a direct security threat.
Wait, so they would argue that importing German cars is a threat to American national security.
It sounds absurd on its face, but legally it is a much harder nut for the court to crack. Courts really hate second-guessing a president when they invoke national security.
Are there any other options?
We are also hearing about a shift to sector-specific attacks. So instead of a global blanket tariff on everything, they might just target the pharmaceutical industry.
Why pharma?
Because it has high leverage and huge populist appeal. It is much easier to sell the public on lowering drug prices by taxing foreign imports than it is to say we're going to tax literally everything you buy.
That makes sense politically. There's also the legislative route, though. He could just finally ask Congress to do it legally.
He could, but that requires winning an internal civil war within his own party.
Because the Republicans are split on this.
Deeply split. You have the populists who love tariffs, and you have the traditional free market types who despise them. Passing a massive tariff law through Congress would be slow, it would be ugly, and it might actually fail.
Which is why Trump prefers the executive order pen.
It's much faster. But as we all learned this morning, it is also much, much riskier.
Okay, so let's wrap this up for you. We have covered a ton of ground today.
Right.
For everyone listening, especially those using this to study English or just wanting to really grasp the news, let's summarize this into 3 key takeaways.
Sounds good. Point 1 is the core content. The Liberation Day policy is dead.
Right.
The reciprocal tariffs, that 10% baseline, the 49% on Cambodia to stop transshipment, the over 100% on China, all of those numbers are officially voided.
Point 2 is the legal basis. This is not a ruling about economics. It was about the Constitution. The court ruled that the president cannot unilaterally use the Emergency Powers Act to seize the power of the purse. That power belongs to Congress.
And point 3 is the ramifications.
Right.
The stock market rallied today because corporate costs went down, but the U.S. government is now facing a $280 billion black hole regarding potential refunds.
And the U.S. has lost its major leverage in global trade deals.
Exactly. It is a brave new world compared to yesterday.
It really is. Now, before we go, do you have one final thought to leave everyone with? Something beyond just the immediate numbers.
I do, actually. We have focused a lot today on the money and the legal mechanics, but I want you to think about the historical precedent here.
Okay.
We have spent decades watching the imperial presidency grow. Presidents from both parties constantly taking more and more power away from Congress.
Right, ruling by executive order.
Yes. And today, for the first time in a very long time, the Supreme Court firmly said, stop.
A real check on the system.
It is. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Is this the end of the imperial presidency in American trade policy? Or is this just a temporary detour before the lawyers find a brand new loophole to do exactly what they want anyway?
That is the trillion-dollar question. We will definitely be watching to see if Plan B works better than Plan A. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Deep Dive.
See you next time.
喜欢这种学习方式，欢迎订阅我的频道，让我们一起用下一个10分钟，把商业英文变简单。